All right, let's go ahead and begin. And I think I have a lot of ground to cover tonight. Uh, so we'll see if we can get through it, or maybe I'll be done in half an hour, but we'll see how it goes. Let's open in prayer. Father, we come before you and thank you for your mercy and love to us. We're thankful for those that have gone on before us who have stood for righteousness and truth in the face of immense persecution and resistance. And I pray that we would have the same sort of attitude and perseverance that they did. I pray you'd help us to understand this. It would be interesting and informative. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so tonight we're going to talk about, hopefully, Roger Williams and some other things too, the surrounding circumstances. But remember, our key verse is Psalm 11:3. If the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? So that's our basis for doing what we do. Who can tell me? And if you have a question anywhere along the way, you can ask me. But who can tell me about what they think about Roger Williams, what they know about Roger Williams, what they learned about, maybe what you learned about Roger Williams in school or whatever. I know the boys learned about him a little bit going through the Abeka program, but what do you know about him besides maybe what you've heard from me?
Going off of my schooling, I knew that he was counted as a Baptist, never heard about anything other than that he was a Baptist. Was responsible for obtaining the first charter of the Charter for Rhode Island, established it specifically for religious freedom because of the persecution that he suffered.
That's pretty good.
The Indians, that's probably about
Yeah, that's pretty good. That's a basically that's it. But we'll cover it. He is generally counted by most people, except for certain Baptists, including us, as the first Baptist. And think I don't think that he was ultimately a Baptist, but he was always a friend of religious liberty and Baptist. But anyway, so tonight we'll look at a little bit of background on the time in which he lived. And he did have quite an impact on American thought and freedom. It's why he's so important to our history. And I think it's important that we know a little bit about him. He was born in 1599 in London, England. And by the way, it would be good to study a little bit of the history of England at this time. The kings still had a fair amount of power. We were talking about that tonight. Kings today in England they have power because they're super wealthy. Anybody with the kind of money they have influence, but they don't have the dictatorial power that kings did then. And it was just a few years, even while Roger Williams is still alive, that Charles I was killed by Oliver Cromwell. He was beheaded, and Oliver Cromwell became the prime minister, I guess you could say. So they already, whatever you want to call him, the head of parliament, or I don't know exactly what his position was, but Charles I was a Catholic, and that was during all of the Protestant Catholic stuff going on. So this was where he was born, 1599, London, England. He attended St. Sepulchre's Church, which was a Church of England, and then he attended Cambridge University. He was actually, I don't know if the word brilliant is the right word, but he was very intelligent, very intelligent. He became gifted in shorthand, and he was brought to the attention of Sir Edward Coke. Now, if you know anything about English history, Sir Edward Coke, who lived from 1552 to 1634, is one of the most famous lawyers who ever lived in England. He is the one who prosecuted Sir Walter Raleigh for treason. Sir Walter Raleigh, if you know anything, again, about English history, Sir Walter Raleigh was a friend of Queen Elizabeth I, who was a Protestant. And after she died, Raleigh took a strong stand against the Catholic and so on. Well, Edward Coke was the one who prosecuted him for treason. Raleigh ended up in the Tower of London for 10 years, and he was beheaded. And later, Coke prosecuted the conspirators in the gunpowder plot. And they were trying to murder King James of, well, I don't have my Bible here, of our King James Bible. So Coke prosecuted them. And then he became the Chief Justice. And as Chief Justice, he did something that at the time, now remember at this point, Williams is his clerk. He's a protege of Coke. So it was at this time, as Chief Justice, that Coke declared the king to be subject to the law, which was anathema. And the laws of Parliament to be void if in violation of common sense and reason. So he really took a strong stand for freedom of the people. He became the friend of the common man. And then he was removed from being Chief Justice for that very stand. And he went into Parliament, and he became leader of the opposition, and he helped pass the Petition of Right. And if you study our Constitution, this Petition of Right is considered fundamental to the English Constitution and Bill of Rights, which was a precursor to our own Constitution. It was part of it, to our own Constitution and Bill of Rights. And so he was very involved in reducing the absolute power of the monarchy. And as Chief Justice, he attacked the Court of High Commission, which was an ecclesiastical court established by the throne that had unlimited power in prosecuting ecclesiastical malfeasance, however you pronounce that, for the state. So there was a melding of state and religious government. And it forced, this Court of High Commission, the ex officio oath on people. It was a religious oath that allowed for religious governmental persecution. And in all of this, Coke took a strong stand against it and ended up supporting and defending the religious dissenters and separatists who would become the Puritans and Pilgrims. And so it was into this atmosphere that the adolescent Williams, because of his ability, became clerk to Coke. He became clerk to Coke when he was 12. He was the same age as, I think, Abram. Are you 12, Abram? So when Coke was 12 years old, he became the clerk, or as they would say in England, the clerk of one of the greatest lawyers in English history. And so this is where he's cutting his teeth. And so this led him to formulate for himself the idea of freedom of conscience, because that's what Coke was fighting for. William saw firsthand the coercion that was used by the throne and the government that forced people to think and worship a certain way. So you can see where this is going as it applies. Remember, we're doing this as it applies to Baptist thought, right? And so at that age of 12, he had already begun to side with the Puritans and Separatists. He'd already formulated ideas about freedom of conscience and freedom of thought and freedom of speech and freedom of worship, and taken the side of the Puritans and Separatists. At that age, he could already read Latin, Hebrew, Greek, Dutch, and French. This is besides English. And became very familiar with the Native American languages later on, which would prove instrumental in how he dealt with and was used in New England. And the two books I used were, this is Beller's book, which I've told you about, of course. And then this is the book written by Isaac Backus in the late 1700s. This is a history of New England with particular reference to the denomination of Christians called Baptists. This is pretty incredible. So I've got a few quotes in here from that. But Backus said that he was considered a holy, this is talking about Williams, a holy and gifted preacher, and he was of good account in England for a godly and a zealous preacher. He was ordained into the Church of England, but while he was at Cambridge, he became a Puritan. So that stifled his future ambition to be a preacher in the Church of England. He graduated from Cambridge in 1627, and he became the personal chaplain of Sir William Masham and his wife, who were Puritan sympathizers. So you can see the direction that he's taking here. And what's interesting, at that time, while he was their personal chaplain, he fell in love with their niece. Oh, so can someone let in the luces? I have to charge them a toll. You have to pay the toll. The toll. Huh? The walk of shame. Anyway, we're talking about Roger Williams. I'm not going to go through the whole thing again. I'm not starting just for your sake. Now, if you'd all walked in late, I'd start all over again. Right? If you walk in late together, is it shameful? Anyway. So, he fell in love with the niece of the Mashams. They were noble. Now, remember, that was one of the things, talking about Roger Williams. That was the nobility was something that you were born into, okay? I don't know how people became noble in the first place. It's a man-made construct. But it was very real, relevant, probably still is in England, maybe not to the same degree. But because of her noble birth, he could not marry the Masham's niece, and which ultimately was providential, I think, because he ended up marrying Mary Bernard, who was the daughter of a Puritan preacher and actually a servant. She was a servant girl to the Mashams, but she was the daughter of a Puritan preacher. And she ended up being a very good wife to Williams, who followed him for 40 years wherever he went. So she stayed right by his side, and they had 6 children during all this. And their children were born in the New World. And so very interesting. And so he and his wife did not join the first wave of settlers, but rather ended up going in 1631. And by that time, in 1631, the Puritans were already enforcing religious intolerance on the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And when we talk about religious intolerance, they were as intolerant as anyone in history, and persecuted and prosecuted anyone who did not believe the way they did, to the fullest extent that they could. But at this point, though, it doesn't seem that Williams even knew that, nor John Clark, who came a little bit later. They were coming over with their eyes full of stars, right? They had high hopes for the New World. But by 1630, not 1930, by 1630, Williams already considered the Church of England corrupt and had become, further than a Puritan, a separatist. And they weren't further away. The Puritans believed, by the way, in purifying the church. The separatists believed in separating from it. So before he had even left for the New World, he had already become a separatist. And he was actually considered, in England, a very independent thinking firebrand. He could think for himself, okay? And combined with his natural intelligence and his ability to reason, that made him dangerous to the standing order. But it is important to note that ultimately he wasn't a true Baptist, even though he was credited by most historians as founding the First Baptist Church in America, in Providence, Rhode Island. But as you'll find out later, that wasn't truly a Baptist church. The distinction belongs to John Clark. And as I mentioned, Williams was a friend to Baptists and religious freedom everywhere, and anyone who wanted to think freely for themselves, any religion. He was a friend of Catholics. He was a friend of Quakers. And that was at a time when people killed each other over what they believed, and there are places where they still do kill you based on how or what you believe or don't believe. So his influence on American political and social thought was profound, as you'll see, and at times it's maligned, and it's like even the other day, I was talking with Pastor Mitchell, and he said, "What are you going to preach about Williams?" And I said, "Well, I'm not going to preach that he founded the first church, Baptist church, but he certainly had a very profound impact on the thinking. You can't denigrate the guy because of because he ultimately wasn't a Baptist. I mean, he was incredible and had a huge impact." And it's interesting, we often think of the principle of freedom of conscience as originating here in America, and it didn't. It had already existed. It's not an American invention, okay? And that's important because sometimes we kind of own it's distinctly American. It's not, I would say it's distinctly Baptist, but it's not distinctly American. But America did become the incubator of freedom of thought and conscience, and ultimately the first nation who embraced it, and the resultant blessing is proof that it was the right direction to go, right? There's never been a nation blessed like this nation. But actually the principle had started long before, but even in the minds of the dissenters in England. And if I was thinking about this, it's even a principle that's taught by the Lord and the apostles. It's all about choice. The Lord never wanted to coerce people. If you decide to follow me, then you have to follow me. But it's a choice you have to make, right? So the Lord certainly makes us free moral agents who have to choose God because we love him. But Williams, in the New World, became its first chief and, I would say, most courageous champion of freedom of thought and conscience. And then we'll digress for a moment into the New World and discuss what had already transpired in New England before Roger Williams got here. So I think I mentioned to you recently, but in 1607, a small colony was settled in what is now Phippsburg. It was called the Sagadahoc colony. That's not particularly well known. I don't even know if that's taught in school. Is that taught in school? It's not taught in school, but it's true. It actually was a colony. We hear about Jamestown and we hear about the Pilgrims, but there was a colony in Sagadahoc in 1607, the same year that Jamestown was founded. And they left before a year passed because their governor died. And of course, Jamestown was settled that same year. But there were no more settlements. Then there was Roanoke, but they disappeared. But there were no more settlements after Jamestown and Sagadahoc for another 13 years. And as I've mentioned, all the things, the roads, the fields, and all that stuff that we just take for granted, when they rolled up on that shore, that coastline, in that ship, it was nothing but trees right down to the rocky coast, and they had to carve their way into it. I mean, the difficulty of it, and the Pilgrims came in November, December, brutally difficult. Okay, but first, before they came, there were two congregations of separatists that had moved out of England because of persecution, because of what they faced. There was the Scrooby congregation led by John Robinson, and there was the Gainsborough congregation under John Smith, and they both of these had pulled up stakes in England and had moved to Amsterdam in Holland. And there, the Mennonites had a profound impact on Smith and the Gainsborough congregation, in that they showed that baptism by immersion of regenerate believers was the correct way to baptize, okay? Now, you know Mennonites have their roots in the Baptists, okay? So, interesting. Smith died shortly thereafter. The Gainsborough church split. Half of them went back to England to plant what some consider the first General Baptist church in England in 1611. But Beller points out, the author here, points out that Baptists were there much earlier, if not in name, in practice, which we know to be true. The Scrooby congregation underneath John Robinson, you remember I read some things to you that John Robinson had written, is now in Leyden, was then in Leyden, Holland. They determined to go to the New World to seek freedom because even there they were facing difficulties. And they had all kinds of obstacles along the way. They had obstacles raising money. They had obstacles in securing ships. They had obstacles in securing grants. Everything was governmental then. You think the bureaucracy is bad today, it was bad then, and there was a lot of religious intolerance. They finally obtained a ship, the Mayflower, and in 1620, 100 of them set sail for what became Plymouth. Okay? And as we mentioned, they faced extreme difficulties after landing, and within the first few months, fully one half of them died. So in just a few months, 50 of the 100 were dead. They continued to persevere in the face of all of that. And based on reading some of Pastor Robinson's writings, the Scrooby congregation did hold to Baptist principles, even though they weren't called Baptists. But they were labeled derogatorily Anabaptists. And it's interesting that Robinson, though he wanted to go, never was able to go to the New World, and he died in 1625 at the age of 50 years after he had a cold or he was sick or whatever. And the remaining congregation were not, most of them anyway, were not able to go because the transportation that they secured for the New World, which were merchant ships, the owners decided they were going to go to the New World for themselves for money's sake. So they deserted them and engaged in their own expeditions for profit. And the leaders, it's interesting, so they don't have a pastor, the Plymouth Church. But their first leaders were John Carver, William Bradford, who I'm sure you've heard of, Edward Winslow successively. And the church itself was initially carried on by elder members of the church, elder men. But it's important to note that later on, the congregation, this is quite a while later, but the congregation was absorbed by the Puritans. And perhaps, and I was thinking about this, perhaps this was due to the fact that during all that time, they didn't have a regular pastor who would come over with them and continue to teach them doctrine. And so they just sort of went their own way. In 1624, the first Puritans arrived and formed the town of, does anybody know which town they formed?
Boston.
Huh?
Boston.
No. Salem. And it grew in size via new settlement until 1628. It wasn't until 1629 that two nonconformist preachers came over and organized a church there. And it was these same men who had berated Robinson for separating from the Church of England. And yet no sooner, as Backus says, no sooner had they set foot on the New World soil, they cast off the prelate's yoke in the same such manner. So they were a lot of hypocrisy as far as these guys were concerned. They were hypocrites. In 1630, Governor Winthrop came over with 1,500 people, and then he established what became known as Boston and a number of other small towns that were surrounding the environs. And in Boston and all the little towns around Boston, the suburbs, they established churches in each town, all related to the mother church. And these men, these people, these families were tired of the tyrannical rule in England. Okay? Yet, they became exactly what they left behind. It kind of reminds me of people. Teresa is from Phoenix, and Phoenix is one of those places where people would go because they had allergies, because it's desert and it's dry. But they get out there and they don't like the desert. They're nostalgic for the old homeland. And so they decide they want to make it look like home, so they irrigate and they plant trees and grass, and then lo and behold, they have allergies again, right? Well, that's kind of what happened here. So they were tired of the tyranny in England as relative to their worship, and yet they became and even worse than what they had left behind. They wanted to establish a new Israel, and they became tyrants, trying to establish a theocracy, which was a melding of church and civil government, and who, on based on the fact that they could severely penalize people, tried to enforce the first half of the Decalogue. Now we enforce the second half, right? Thou shalt not kill, talking about murder. Thou shalt not bear false witness, right? Thou shalt not commit adultery. Even being obedient to your parents, that has punitive repercussions. But the first table of the Decalogue we can't enforce. That's something that has to come from the heart. But that's what they were trying to do. John Cotton, who with his son became famous in the colony for his iron rule, came over in 1633. And he had been, if not a friend in England, a colleague of William's, which is interesting. And Cotton, organized the church in areas he felt were out of order. And it soon came to pass that whatever he preached from the pulpit was put into the order of the court, civil and ecclesiastical. Okay? So that there was no difference. They were one. They established 4 principles, which in and of themselves were not bad, and which for the most part we would agree with, but they carried over from the Mother Church of England 2 other principles, which have been a source of corruption for all time. And those 2 principles were that natural birth and the doings of men can bring children into the covenant of grace, and that it is right to enforce and support their own sentiments about religion with the magistrate's sword. So we know that to be false. In other words, the first part, the first of those 2 was that because I'm a member in good standing of this church, that my children, simply through natural birth and being baptized as an infant, can become a member in good standing of the church. And that if you don't agree with it, I can throw you in the stockade. That's what that was all about. Would have been exciting to live under that sort of establishment, right? But that's the way it was in New England for the first 150 years. You know, this freedom that we have, that we take for granted, they didn't have that. And of these last 2 principles, Isaac Backus says this: and those, let them live in England, Scotland, Rome, or elsewhere, who reproach and condemn New England for the evils which these 2 principles have produced, while they hold the same things, ought to consider that in so doing they will be found inexcusable before our great judge. It's wicked, just absolute wickedness. And Isaac Backus, by the way, is considered the greatest Baptist historian of all time. And further than that, in 1631, the root of compulsive uniformity, this is before Cotton got there, was planted in the General Court in Boston, when it was ordered and agreed that for the time to come, no man shall be admitted to the freedom of this body politic, but such as are members of some of the churches within the limits of the same. And Backus says this test in after times had such influence that he who did not conform was deprived of more civil privileges than a nonconformist is deprived of by the test in England. Both the one and the other must have occasioned much formality and hypocrisy. And it ended up people lost their health, they lost their homes, they lost their families. Some of them lost their lives for all of this. So it was into this atmosphere that Roger Williams came with his firebrand views of freedom of conscience, freedom of worship, freedom of speech in 1631. And he came with high hopes and high praise, but soon he found himself on the outs with the leaders. It didn't take very long. In fact, it was immediately. The separatist doctrine had become more than just something that he gave mental assent to, but it had become a conviction. And Williams, though they tried to intimidate him, was not a man to be cowed. And that's the type of men that a situation like that requires. It requires men who refuse to compromise, who refuse to be intimidated, and are absolutely convinced that what they believe is right. In England, Williams had actually become acquainted with Cotton and Hooker, that's Thomas Hooker, while riding in a carriage with them, and had at the time what probably seemed like an innocent conversation about their views of the church and government. And he remonstrated with them because they were saying, here they are, separatists and Puritans, and they're saying, we want to go and establish a theocracy, and it was just a friendly conversation. But when Cotton actually did get into power in New England, he actually tried to do just that. And the thing about that is that Cotton himself, who was the chief persecutor in New England, had been persecuted and driven to exile and had to go on the run in England for exactly the same thing. So a lot of hypocrisy. So as soon as Williams arrived, he was made pastor of the church at Salem. Now this is Salem of later witch trial fame, okay? But the Boston church withheld their approval because, one, he refused to join with the congregation of Boston because they would not make a public declaration of their repentance for holding communion with the Church of England. And two, he declared it his opinion that the civil magistrates might not punish any breach of the first table of the law. So he was refused at that point from being the pastor of Salem. Instead, he became the pastor in Plymouth for 2 to 3 years. And he became friends with Governor Bradford. And Governor Bradford said of Williams, quote, he was freely entertained according to our poor ability and exercised his gifts among us, and after some time was admitted a member of the church, and his teaching well approved, for the benefit whereof I still bless God, and am thankful to him even for his sharpest admonitions and reproofs, so far as they agreed with truth. So he was quite a preacher. So he became friends with the Plymouth folks. And but Backus points out that these 2 points, where they refused him the pastorate of Salem, were so offensive to the rulers at Boston, they became the foundational cause of their proceedings against Mr. Williams. He was formally charged. And Backus mentions that they closely affect the history of our country to this day, and because of that, they demand our close attention. So Backus was writing in the late 1700s, and he said that these things had an effect that were being felt even down to his time. And this led to his ultimate banishment back to England in 1635. And Backus gives 2 official reasons, as stated by Mr. Cotton himself. Williams, listen to this, quote, Williams' violent and tumultuous carriage against the patent. The patent was that the king made it possible for the magistrates to establish laws and government and execute justice according to a government of the church. In other words, it was really the church that ran the state and could determine, based on whether someone was baptized or a member in good standing, whether they were prosecuted or not. Furthermore, this patent granted that the king could lay claim to any land discovered by Christian explorers, thus enabling the settlers to expunge the Native Americans, which, as you know, is still a sticking point to this day. But Williams was quite a friend of the Indians, and he learned their native tongue very quickly. And it says that Williams publicly and vehemently preached against this sort of thing. And the second reason they charged him with, Williams preached against the ironically titled Oath of a Free Man, which stated, quote, the general court made an order. Listen to this here. It's so unaware. I don't know. The general court made an order of court to take trial of the fidelity of the people, not by imposing upon them, but by offering to them an oath of fidelity, that in case any should refuse to take it, remember that it's offered to them, they might not betrust them with place of public charge and command. So that's that oath of a free man. Do you hear that? I'll read it again just so you get it. The general court made an order of court to take trial of the fidelity of the people. Fidelity is their loyalty. Not by imposing upon them, but by offering to them an oath of fidelity, that in case any should refuse to take it, they might not betrust them with place of public charge and command. So while they're saying they're offering it to them freely as a test, they say if they don't take it, we're going to impose punitive damages, right? So it really wasn't the oath of a free man. So it's misleading, to say the very least. Beller points out that it was really jumping from the frying pan into the fire for the folks there. They were free from the mother church in England, but then they had to swear to the new church to be a member. And to be a member of the new church, one had to be infant baptized. Okay? And Cotton himself stated that Williams vehemently preached against the hypocrisy of the oath. So you can see why they didn't like him. And then thirdly, and this is something else that was mentioned, Williams was opposed to the practice of the patent which granted in 1634 the taxing of the people to support the clergy. Okay? In other words, the people didn't have any choice. They were levied a tax, they had to pay it, and that was to support the clergy. They had to supply everything for him. And what do we teach? What does the Bible teach? You support the pastor because you love the pastor and the pastorate. It's right before the Lord, but you do it because you want to, not because you have to. If you don't want to, you don't have to, right? That's how it works. And his opinions, as they were called, were labeled dangerous. Does that not sound similar to what we're hearing today in all the censorship, right? That the ideas and the speech that some people proffer are dangerous ideas and dangerous speech? Well, that flies totally in the face of our Constitution and Bill of Rights. But that's exactly what they did. They labeled Williams' speech dangerous, that the magistrates could not punish the breach of the first table of the law, and what Williams preached, if such breach did not otherwise disturb civil peace, and that the oath must not be tendered to an unregenerate man, and that a regenerate man ought not to pray with such. And those churches, of course, were filled with unregenerate people who were taking communion with each other and with other churches. And this was all from Governor Winthrop's journal. So basically the biggest problem they had with Williams was that he denied the civil magistrates the right to govern ecclesiastical affairs, which was a denial of money, was a denial of power. Really, it was about power and money, ultimately. Control. And remember that this was 150 years before our Revolutionary War and subsequent Constitution was written. And Williams' response, while still the pastor at Salem, was that he would not communicate with the churches of the Bay, Massachusetts Bay, or at Boston, except they break communion with the mother church. And in the face of the civil government and all the other pastors of the churches gathered together in court, William refused to back down. So he had an immense amount of pressure being placed on him. His own church ultimately in Salem stood against him. At first they didn't. There was a level where they were backing him, but in the pressure that they faced, they backed down, and he ultimately refused to take communion with them. And that was a land for preacher deal. The court at Boston told the church at Salem wanted Marbleneck, the beach at Marbleneck. I've never been there. It probably is not the same now as it was then, but apparently it was a beautiful tract of land right on the coast. And they were told that they could either keep the preacher or they could keep the beach, but they couldn't keep both. And Beller says, sarcastically, that being true and loyal Americans, they elected to keep the beach and lose their pastor. So I thought that was kind of funny. There was even talk of executing Williams. Such was the opposition to him. So he was banished, but is it any wonder that Williams did not show up? Because there was talk of executing him. At least they would have put him in jail, and ultimately they would have put him on a ship. But he got away during a blizzard. And I want you to consider the perseverance of the man. He traveled 55 miles on foot through deep snow. And at first he found some solace among some Plymouth sympathizers, but the new governor wanted him to go to Rhode Island, which at the time was called the sewer of New England. It was probably a lot of lowland, I would imagine, boggy area. But that land was controlled by the Narragansett Indians. But the thing is, Williams believed in treating the Indians with honesty and respect, which was very unusual for that day. As you know, if you know anything about American history, you know that that's generally not the case. It's not to say that the Indians never committed atrocities and so on. They did too, but it went both ways. They weren't noble, like the noble savage that we read about often, like Natty Bumppo. Was it Nathaniel Hawthorne that wrote about the noble savage? But nevertheless, they're men, and they deserve to be treated with respect. And William certainly did, and he learned their language, and they considered him a friend. And Williams wrote, "I testify and declare in the holy presence of God that when at my first coming into these parts," that's Rhode Island, "I obtained the lands of Seekonk, of Osamoquin, Massasoit, the then chief sachem on that side, the governor of Plymouth, Mr. Winslow, wrote to me in the name of their government their claim of Seekonk to be in their jurisdiction, as also their advice to remove, but over the river unto this side where he's at now, where by God's merciful providence we are, and that I should be out of their claim and be as free as themselves and loving neighbors altogether." So that was William's view of living in peace with people and letting people be free to worship. Now, of course, he didn't mean licentiousness. He was talking about true freedom. So that was how Williams, his wife, his 2 little children, and 11 followers migrated to the land north of the Narragansett Bay on the Seekonk River. And he had been 14 weeks on the run at that point. And the little colony became known as Providence, Rhode Island. And Providence and Rhode Island became a safe haven for Baptists, Quakers, and any people who were denied public worship or public expression for their beliefs. And that's the basis of a free society. If you can't freely speak your mind, even if it's offensive to others, then you're not truly free. If you'll be censored, or if you'll be put in jail, or doxxed, as they say today, or have your livelihood taken away, or lose your ability to earn an income because of what you say, then you're not free. You're not truly free. You should have the freedom to say whatever you want. I'm not talking the argument, you can't yell fire in a crowded. We're not talking about that, and neither was Roger Williams. But if you don't have the freedom of expression, that even if it's offensive to someone else, then you're not truly free. And he understood that. But Rhode Island, of all places, became the safe haven and the first free place in the United States, or what was to become the United States. Williams ended up going back to England in 1643 to obtain a charter for Rhode Island, and again in 1651 to have it confirmed. He became the first president of Rhode Island and remained in public office for the rest of his life. And he remained a friend of the Indians and was used to broker peace between them and the colonists. As an example, shortly after he was banished in 1636, the Pequot Indian War broke out. And there was a group of Indians that were engaged in war against the Boston colony. And the court called to Roger Williams. This is the court that had just banished him. They called for Roger Williams to come and broker peace, or between them and the Narragansetts, and to ally themselves with the Narragansetts so they could fight against the Pequot Indians, which is exactly what Williams did. Williams didn't tell them no. They asked him to help resolve the war because he was on friendly footing, because he spoke their language, and because I read later that they trusted him more than they trusted anybody else. They trusted Roger Williams. And that kind of goes against the narrative that we hear today, that there were all the white people were scum, and they all of them treated the Indians badly. That is not the case. There were actually at times good relationships between the Indians and the settlers, and Roger Williams had the very best relationship with them. So anyway, he worked it out because of their trust for him, and the Narragansetts and the colonists defeated the Pequot Indians in 1638. And even though Williams was asked to and succeeded in helping the Boston colonists in this war, his ban was never lifted. They were very ungrateful, and there is no record of him of ever returning to the Boston colony. He might have been better off, I don't know. In 1637, the General Court exiled a number of other families, among them John Clark. John Clark, we're going to look at him next time, Lord willing, but he was a very idealistic preacher who came over, true Baptist, who came over with high hopes, and they were dashed as soon as he set foot on the shores of the colonies. In 1638, the Providence Compact was made, and it stated, "We whose names are underwritten, being desirous to inhabit in the town of Providence, do promise to submit ourselves in active or passive obedience to all such orders or agreements as shall be made for public good of the body in an orderly way, by the major consent of the present inhabitants, matter of families, incorporated together into a township, and such others whom they shall admit unto the same, only, and this is the issue, this little addendum at the end of it, the Providence Compact, only in civil things." So that it almost sounds like the same, but you notice they use the term basically that they were willfully submitting to civil government, but that civil government had no influence or power over the religious government. And that's exactly what we would hate. What if they came in and told us how we're going to worship, when we're going to worship, what we're going to preach? And that is happening in places, and they're trying to do it here. Ultimately, they probably will. But we have to stand against that. And it helps us to recognize that there were those in our past who took a strong stand and had to sacrifice a lot to take the stand. In 1638, Williams and 12 others formed a Baptist church, but that's not a church that we recognize as the first Baptist church in America, as Williams didn't remain a Baptist for long, although he was always a friend of the baptized. He was baptized, but not by an ordained preacher. He was baptized by just a man that was following him. His name was Holman. And then after he baptized Roger Williams baptized him and all the other people there. And then a few months later, Williams renounced his baptism because he could find no scriptural warrant for an unbaptized person baptizing anyone. So he renounced his own baptism. At least he was honest. Okay? And he's considered, perhaps then, today, a seeker. But not a seeker in the sense of, someone who's always looking for the truth. But a seeker in the sense that people were labeled seekers who were separatists yet could find no legitimate establishment. In other words, he was kind of in limbo, right? Why he never joined with John Clark, I don't know. I mean, there's actually not a lot written about Williams. I mean, you're getting, there's more obviously than what I'm relating here, but you're getting pretty much the rundown. But he did have a salvation experience at a young age in England, which his father, who was loyal to the Church of England, disapproved of. So it appears that he truly was saved. But regardless of whether he was a Baptist or not, he was truly a great and courageous man and an integral part of our history, whose fight against tyrannical civil and ecclesiastic government spurred others to do the same. Perhaps if he hadn't done it, things wouldn't have turned out the way they did. It took one man who was willing to stand, and that stand began to spread into others spread to John Clark and men like Obadiah Holmes and others of that time. Williams also wrote The Bloody Tenet of Persecution in 1644, and I've read excerpts from it. But that was a response to John Cotton's writings that the civil government can tell people how, when, where, and what to worship. And the Bloody Tenet of Persecution detailed the coercive ways of the Standing Order Church / civil government in New England. And listen to this. This is what Williams wrote. And he wrote that there should be separation between church and state, and there should be walls of separation between the various branches. This is 150 years before the Constitution was written. This is before John Locke. In fact, the Bloody Tenet of Persecution was one of the writings that influenced the philosopher John Locke, who was born in the 1620s, 1630s. And further in the Bloody Tenet of Persecution, Williams wrote that competing religious views should be respected. And these are all integral parts of our founding documents, which we take for granted. And Williams wrote these out of his own head in the Bloody Tenet of Persecution. He truly was ahead of his time, and he was a brilliant man. And he had to take all of these things that he had learned, and they be and impressions and ideas and principles, and he was able to formulate a doctrine, and put it into writing so that others could see it and be influenced by it. See, that's the great thing about a true statesman and someone who really has the ability to communicate. You might understand something, you might have the impression of something, you might have this feeling that something is not right, but it's being able to think about it, to formulate cogent ideas about it, and then to take that and put it on paper so that it has an impact and an influence on other people. And Roger Williams was able to do that. And so his writings, his influence, his courage had a profound impact on other men, and not only in the United States or in the colonies of the time, but in England as well. John Locke was English. And so it absolutely had an effect. Locke, of course, if you know anything about the Founding Fathers, they really adopted a number of Locke's philosophies, and he in turn was influenced by, at least in part, by Roger Williams. And James Beller writes this: over 350 years have passed since the banishment of Mr. Williams and the founding of Rhode Island Colony. Historians are still trying to sort out the details and come to their proper conclusions. Our Mr. Williams had been beloved and hated, venerated and dismissed. Secular historians minimize his influence for fear of a Christian recension in American history. Christian historians discredit him for fear that a Baptist flavoring in the mix of our American heritage will emerge, and Baptist historians are quick to point out his flaws. For Williams did not remain a Baptist and perhaps brought an invalid baptism upon his little flock. Perhaps. However, I'm still quoting, if what we mean by being American is freedom, liberty of conscience, the right to worship God as we deem correct, yet without coercion or interference by the government, then Roger Williams was the first American. An army of others would soon follow. So that's it from me. Anybody have any questions or comments? Bore you? So, anybody? Have you ever heard of Roger Williams before? No, I know you have. I'm just kidding.